I'm from the government, and I'm here to help you. We sometimes hear people sort of make that as to get the effect I just got, to get a chuckle. But when public officials make this statement, I have to say, isn't it odd that it does elicit a chuckle as if it was a joke? When in fact, that's what public officials do. They work for us, the public. And they are there to serve us. And I think it's just an indication of how cynical we are, how negative we are, how quick we are in assuming that they don't mean what they're saying, they must be lying to us, they've got some other agenda. And so it's not easy to get people to really, really understand, no, these officials actually are dedicating their lives, or a big chunk of their lives, to work for us on things like, I mean, those of you who are not working, how would you like to work in sludge disposal? That's the ultimate final residue that's left from what you wash down your toilet. They invest their lives cleaning up some mess we all make, and then we turn around and act as if somehow they were doing something else. So we're going to take a microscope into why is this so. And I want you to know it's not this way in all countries where people sort of get contempt rather than respect. And that's why I had the title up here is, if you can learn to govern with consent, informed consent, you should be developing, I'm saying you, those of you who work in government, you should be able to develop legitimacy, trust, respect, credibility, and maybe, I don't know yet you deserve it, but maybe even admiration. It seems to be possible, is going to be my argument. But what I'm talking about here is that it doesn't seem to be automatic. Sorry, I must have pushed the wrong button here. It isn't automatic. If you learn to govern with consent, the expression, I'm here from the government, I'm from the government here to help you, should not be a joke. And we have plenty of clients who have learned that it doesn't have to be a joke, that people actually can understand it. One particular individual, a very creative guy in the Alaska Department of Transportation, and his job is to go out to communities, usually with bad news. It's bad news, you know, where the communities have to do things they thought the state would do. He said, I use the expression, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help you. And he says, nobody smirks, nobody laughs, because they have learned I really, really mean it, even when I am bad news. So this business of legitimacy, trust, respect, I'm going to talk about the first couple of items and then maybe invite a couple of questions. I'll talk about item number 3, which is sort of a biggie, and then maybe ask at that point a couple of questions, or maybe after the 5th item, legitimacy. In the training that we will do for Tom and his staff and some of the other people, we're going to spend probably half a day on this, but I just want to cram in a little bit of what the heck constitutes legitimacy. When do we as publics consider an agency or a project or the whole darn government, in this case local government or state government, or it applies at any level of government, federal, when do we consider them legitimate and when do we not? See, when you consider them legitimate, you don't make cheap jokes about them, you don't. When we make cheap jokes, which most of us do, and I'm as bad as anybody, I hate to admit. See, making fun of government, you have to understand, in America is a recreational activity, okay? In other countries, it's unacceptable. Here, yeah, here it's recreational activity. If you have legitimacy as a bureaucracy, the public's reaction is, thank God you're there. And if you work in the public arena and your own public says, thank God you're there. Wow, thank God somebody had the vision to create your project or your program or your agency. Thank God you're willing to devote a major part of your life to it. That's a relationship of legitimacy versus those people feeding at the government trough. How are we going to get rid of them? that's a sign of illegitimacy. One of the exercises we will do with the folks who are in that training, we don't have time to do it here, I'll just tell you about it. Maybe you can mentally do it. We will ask each person to write down a project or a program at some level of government where they are not working. So let's say at the federal level, that you think is really important, the government really needs to be doing. You can also make a list of things that you wish they were not doing, that you think are not legitimate. I'll have everybody do that, and then to discuss it with their group for a little bit. And you will see that a very mixed bag of projects and programs written down. We don't all think the same things are important, but they all have the same ingredients in it. Those of you, for example, let's look at President Bush's agenda. President Bush right now seems to have high on his agenda fixing the social security issues. Now, those of you who agree with him, who say, thank God he's addressing that, I can tell you what you're seeing in there. And those of you who are saying, I wish he were not addressing it, I can tell you what you're seeing in it. Those of you who are saying, thank God he invaded Iraq, thank God we're there doing this, I can tell you what you're seeing in it. And I can tell you what those of you who are saying, we shouldn't have done that, we shouldn't be there, I can tell you what you're seeing in it. Those projects, those programs that in your eyes have legitimacy have two ingredients. And these two ingredients are always there for something that's legitimacy, that is considered legitimate. Anne-Marie and I have racked our brains for the last 25 years. Why does this American public, which is so quick at bad-mouthing government, before they even know what the heck it is, well, it's government doing it, boy, it must be stupid. I mean look at President Clinton. He ran on a platform in his first election that he wanted to address the public health issues and funding of public health issues. Now, please understand, every president since Truman has tried. Truman, Eisenhower, Nixon, they all tried. None of them could. Clinton was the first one to run on it, so he had more of a mandate than anybody. What was the single biggest criticism that torpedoed that project? Is when Louise, and what was her friend, that ad that was on television so successfully? Frank and Louise, or Mike and Louise? Over the breakfast table, they would discuss, what are they going to do? The single biggest criticism was, well, you know what it's going to be? It's going to be another big federal program. Oh my God, kill it before it gets off the ground, okay? The fact that government is doing, boy, it'll get botched up, okay? Nothing else needs to be said. That's how little legitimacy government seems to have. But not when these two ingredients in it. The first ingredient is this one. This thing, this observation is so big, it deserves to be called the first law of public administration. If thermodynamics deserves the first and second law, I think public administration deserves the first and second law. A governmental project, program, plan, regulation, bond issue that does not address a serious problem and or that's perceived not to address a serious problem is living on borrowed time. Those of you who think that there's a serious problem with Social Security, you want it addressed. Those of you who think there's no problem, you don't want it addressed. Only those projects and programs in the United States are in the long term considered legitimate that address problems. Now, ideally, it's a future problem, one that hasn't happened yet, because smart problem solving means preventing problem. It's not real smart to wait for the problem to happen and then try to solve it. So smart problem solving 99% of the time means making projections, predictions, and saying we're going to have this problem. Here's what we need to do to prevent it. Sometimes the problem is already here, then we tackle it. Sometimes the problem is a missed opportunity, where you say, gosh, we have this opportunity, and if we don't take advantage of it, it's gone, and we will kick ourselves for the next 50 years. So missed opportunities also seem to be problems. Notice there are two aspects. There's the reality of a problem and the perception. It's not enough that government says there is a problem. they have to communicate it. So if President Bush is right that it's a serious problem, the demographics, the way the projections go, he's going to have to convince those folks who are not convinced. But for those people where he won't accomplish this, he will not have legitimacy on that. Those people who think Saddam Hussein and that regime creates problems, creates real threats, then it's legitimate to do something. If there's no real threat, no real problem, don't do anything. Even NASA has to justify itself. Even a museum has to. If there are no important problems or missed opportunities, we don't want government to do it. Now, please understand, other countries are different. In the United States, this seems to be the single biggest ingredient. If you're legitimate, you're a problem-solving, problem-preventing, problem-reducing, opportunity-maximizing outfit. One question this raises, what constitutes a serious problem? Anna Marie and I think we have the American public figured out on that one, too. We call it the second law of public administration. Gosh, I must be pushing the wrong button all the time. Unless you can argue convincingly that failure to address the problem at hand, so a given project must be addressing a problem. Unless you can argue convincingly that not solving the problem, if you don't solve it, it will significantly reduce somebody's quality of life. If you can't make that argument, you're going to have a hard time convincing the American public. So the American public seems to only consider those problems serious that have something to do with somebody's quality of life. Not necessarily their own, just somebody's. Not necessarily everybody's, just somebody's. Not even a lot of people's, just somebody's. Now, one fallout from this is, if you are government, never ever propose doing something because of a law. We've got to do it because it's a law. It's one of the weakest arguments you can make. You're on thin ice if that's the best argument you can make. Why? Because you all have a strange attitude towards laws. I mean, it's a complicated, strange attitude. Americans, on the one hand, are the most law-abiding people, and at the same time, they're not. Never say we got to do this because we're not meeting standards. Or we're in violation of EPA standards. I assure you, your public is not losing sleep over EPA standards. You may be, they are not. It has to be somebody's quality of life. Whose quality of life will suffer if you fail in your mission, and how? They have to be able to picture it, who that is and how. They will then judge, is that a problem or isn't it? But if they can't make the quality of life connection in their mind, it's not a serious problem. Those of you who think it's a powerful argument to say, oh, we got to do this because it's the law. Let me give you a short demonstration how impressed Americans are by laws. Now, for this experiment to work, you have to be honest, but then, of course, you are. Who here among you will knowingly be violating speed limits in the next 72 hours? Could I have a show of hands? All right, all right. Now, once in a while, I address a room full of California highway patrolmen. And one of their complaints is, they say, Hans, the American public has a cavalier attitude towards speed laws. I said, I know, get over it. They said, what do you mean, get over it? It's the law. I said, get over it. That's Americans for you. Look at your cavalier attitude towards speed laws. If you're a state regulator in their Department of Environmental Quality or whatever, don't be surprised if your public has the same cavalier attitude towards the standards and laws you're trying to enforce and implement that you seem to exhibit towards speed laws. What you have to do is communicate. What does that standard, what does that regulation, what does that law have to do with somebody's quality of life? And don't make it up. Give us the real connection. Whose quality of life will be less than it ought to be if you don't do what you're doing. The moment that clicks with Americans, you have legitimacy, or at least the possibility for legitimacy. Again, in a lot of countries, if it's the law, it's not debatable. In America, well, Americans think we have a lot of stupid laws. I'll just ignore those. You know, so what's the standard of legitimacy? Quality of life. It's this. We have pulled that little exercise of having somebody write something down that they're willing to have their taxes increased in order not to abolish a program. We have done it with thousands of people. We have never had somebody write down a project, a department, an agency that did not meet these two standards. The reason the person wrote it down is because, Bleiker, this is a problem. Or this is we're going to piss away this opportunity if we don't do it. And say, well, so what? Then they come up with a quality of life argument and say this will be less of a quality of life than it ought to be. And see, that's when we want government to do something. Even anti-government people who would like less and less government and preferably no government, they're not against government that addresses serious problems. Whoops, where did we go here? Problems that have something to do with somebody's quality of life. This is where legitimacy comes from, as far as we can tell. If you're a legitimate public agency, whether we're talking about federal, state, regional, special district, anything, you're a problem-solving, problem-preventing, opportunity-maximizing outfit. Now make sure, number one, that you are, is what we will teach in the 2.5-day course. Number two, communicate that you are. And we don't mean propaganda. You have to get people to understand that you are. It's your mission, your responsibility, your reason for being, your raison d'etre to address problems if you're a legitimate outfit. It's really interesting when you look at when somebody creates a new agency in our country, whether it's federal or local, the only time we do it, we perceive a problem. President Bush was going to have less government than President Clinton. And I'm sure he meant it. And then came 9/11. And within a month, he doesn't care what things cost. Why? As far as he sees, these are problems where cost is not an issue. So even somebody who is sort of anti-government has a platform of less and less and less government. Creates more and more and more. And I want you to know that's how you are wired. That's how we all seem to be wired here. Now, the business of trust. We have a lot of public officials say, Bleiker, they don't trust us. And where people think, well, this is sort of a nice thing to be trusted. No, it's much simpler than. Like, you don't have to walk on water. You don't have to be perfect. You have to be trusted even though you will periodically screw up because you're human, and humans lay an egg now and then. And you need to be trusted anyway. So what is trust all about, as far as we can tell? Since your legitimacy comes from your mission, your problem-solving, preventing mission. So if you have a legitimate mission, it's a problem-solving, problem-preventing, problem-reducing, opportunity-maximizing mission. Achieving that mission is what people have entrusted you with. Whether you're an elected official, an appointed, or even a volunteer, or you are a hired staff, you have some part of a problem-solving mission. It's that responsibility, those duties, those reasons for those obligations that we have entrusted you. If and only if we think you have really, really, really bought into that problem-solving mission, do we trust you. You don't even have to achieve the mission if we just think you're trying. You're trying your best. You're knocking yourself out. Even if it's not working, we will trust you. If we think you have some other agenda, one you're not admitting, some hidden agenda, we will never trust you. So it's critical that those of you who are in government, that you understand what that mission is, that problem-solving mission. And if you can't buy into it, don't be part of that government, because people will smell a rat. So you must understand it and then really, really buy into it. And if you can't buy into it, find some other way of earning a living. To say the school system's mission is to educate the young is to say that The school system's responsibility, duty, obligation is to educate the young. This includes predicting and projecting problems that will interfere with this education mission, predicting and projecting opportunities that could aid in this mission, developing and proposing solutions, plans to political decision makers for accomplishing that mission, and then implementing it. Now that's just education, but it's true for all kinds of public agencies, whether it has to do with public health, public safety, environment, natural resources. It's always with preventing problems, solving problems, which of course gets very complicated. So we need scientists, we need planners, we need engineers who do projection and prediction. What's going to happen if we do nothing over the next 20 years? What will happen here? And then identifying problems, identifying opportunities, developing solutions. And that gets into the very technical, but it has to do with solving problems, preventing problems, reducing problems, maximizing opportunities. For each legitimate agency, there is a mission, a problem-solving mission, comprised of responsibilities, duties, obligations. Now, one of the things, if you understand this, and if you are some sort of a government official or bureaucrat, you will never, ever say, we want to do this. We would like to do this. The city would like to do this. Say, never. Why? Because you don't propose what you do because you want to. It's because you have to. You need to. You should be fired if you didn't have the guts to. Duties are not want to. If a cop says, I'd like to arrest you, so find a better hobby. I mean, what a sick hobby to have. But if he says, I have to arrest you. You committed a crime, and I should be fired if I didn't have the guts to. I may have to say, oh, okay, officer, do your duty, okay? If you're a legitimate public official, you propose what you propose out of responsibility and duty and obligation. Now, be sure you communicate that. People in the private sector, they can propose things because they want to. Government never, ever has that luxury, not in the United States. The only legitimate thing they can propose is things that have to do with their missions, which means they are duties, and they have to do with preventing problems, solving problems, reducing problems, maximizing opportunities. Especially those who work in this as professionals. Politically elected people have a little more latitude because I might choose to run for office because I have a particular vision. And I want the community to pursue this. And as long as I run on that, I then can propose, I want to do this. But once that's adopted as policy, it then becomes mission and duty and responsibility. Professionals do not have that luxury. To work in an agency that has such a mission and to not accept the concomitant problem-solving, problem-preventing, opportunity maximizing responsibility, that's to violate the public's trust. For example, for somebody to allow himself or herself to be hired as a superintendent of education and then not do the very, very best to create the best educational system that's possible for that community. To have a public works director who seems to buy into making sure we have reliable water supplies, clean water supplies, other kind of things into the future, and then not have the guts to propose what has to be proposed. That's to violate the trust. If people catch on to that you are proposing what you're doing out of duty, they will trust you. It's not rocket science. So those of you who work in some sort of public office, especially if you're hired, make sure you understand what those missions are. Do some soul searching. Can I really buy into that? You see, what profession means, professionals are people who profess something. A health profession professes to dedicate their lives to our health, not their own health. And a civil engineer professes to work primarily for public safety, and even when they have to recommend something we don't want to hear. So if you're a professional in the public arena, you have special responsibility because you profess that you will recommend what is necessary. Could we have a couple questions maybe on what I've covered here? Because we can sort of shift gears and get into a somewhat different territory at this point. Who has a microphone? Okay, here, and then we'll go over there to that gentleman there. We just have a couple questions. You know, I want to...
You mentioned Clinton's healthcare program. I would offer number one that his biggest problem was his wife, who headed up the program. But more informed with what you were saying about trust was what she was doing was behind closed doors.
That was another problem, yes. That
So
was not wise on
comment
her
on that?
part. Yeah. Yeah. The gentleman back there. Well, I'm not sure there was a question. It was simply an observation.
I was asking an observation.
Yeah, and I fully agree. Those were not smart things to do. Yeah, they would not necessarily kill the program, though. I mean, you can do a lot dumber things than that. Yes.
You mentioned that you identify a problem and then government solves it. Well,
If it's legitimate. Yeah.
right. Let's say you have a legitimate problem.
Yeah.
Government identifies it, and the problem may be solved because it just gets solved on its own. But let's say government solves it. I use the word inertia. Once government gets involved with a problem and solving it, it never goes away. It being government, it just continues to deal with the problem over and over, even though there is no longer a
Well,
problem.
that's when you have ineffective government, I would agree. Yeah.
Well,
And that's, of course, what creates some of this cynicism and say, hey, you never really solve problems. Okay?
Well, no, they do, but they never stop. The inertia just continues to go on and on. It's like we solved the problem, now how do we continue to keep our bureaucracy going?
Well,
How do you deal with inertia?
inertia?
Stopping it. Stopping the
That's a
inertia.
matter of physics. I suspect you can't suspend the inertia. You're going to have to figure out how to have the effective government in spite of that, just like you can't suspend gravity. Okay. No, that better not. See, that's also a sign that somebody has not really bought into solving a problem. Because the professional has bought into it, they will not work on a problem that no longer is a problem. They won't. That is a symptom we don't really have legitimate government. Which, of course, then makes us suspicious and makes us cynical, okay. Which is what I stress is, it's the professionals in it. They must really buy into the problem-solving thing. So they will not be tempted to it's just a job. You know, we don't really solve problems. That's a good way to undermine legitimacy of government. Let me go on to the next topic, because this one gets a little more complicated, which has to do with respect and informed consent, and I decided to cover both of these. It was Alan who said, can you do this with your left hand? And I said, sure. This is why I keep pushing the wrong button. It's my left hand. I can't push a button with my left hand. Problem solving has to do with figuring out how things work. You know, we arrived yesterday on a red-eye flight from California, and we were actually going to go to the Naval Museum because I'm sort of an aviation freak, but I took the wrong turn and I turned left instead of right at the end of Highway 110 and waterfront, and we wound up going out to the Bleiker Islands there and seeing all the damage. And having been trained as an architect, I'm not an expert on tsunamis and on hurricanes and all this, but I can tell you, I understand that if you build on those islands like in North Carolina, Massachusetts has a few islands like, I mean, it's not unusual. We all like to be down by the ocean, we do. New Jersey, south of Atlantic City has them. We do this over and over. But earlier or later, that darn ocean comes in, okay? It's just a matter of time. And so we got to figure out how that works. What does the water do? If you have a structure, can it survive? Can you build it in a way where it won't wipe you out? Are there things? And that's, of course, trying to figure out how things work. That has to do with your health. all of us try to eat a diet so it won't kill us, even though some of the things we like may not be good for us, so we can still eat things we like and also eat the things we should. So there too, we all have to sort of become students. Well, how does your body work? What's all this business about minerals and proteins and all this? This is all part of problem solving. We analyze how things work. Now, sometimes there are scientists who just do research for the sake of research. It has to have no practical application, okay? A lot of the research has to do with figuring how things work so we will understand problems, so we can predict problems, so we can minimize damage, so we can come up with solutions. Analyzing problems and then developing the full range of alternative solutions. Now, analyzing the problems is a very different activity from generating solutions. This has to do with creativity and art. This has to do with engineering and systems analysis. It's an objective activity that lends itself to science to some degree. Now, decision-making has to do with making choices. When we solve problems, we come up with alternative solutions. We then have to choose one of them. Which course of action? And that's very different. That has to do with evaluating the alternatives that we perceive from the value systems that we have, and then figuring out which of them would fulfill our likes, dislikes, hopes, dreams the best, the most. Does it mean we can't live near the ocean? Or does it mean we can, but we can minimize the risk or reduce the risk by building in certain ways? So there are generally alternative courses of action. And evaluation does not lend itself to science. Now, you can be rigorous about it, but I think science would be the wrong term for it, even though there is, because it's a very complicated mix of bags, likes, dislikes, hopes, dreams, fears. But that's eventually why we do problem solving, so we can then make more informed decisions, better decisions. These two mesh. Sometimes we call the whole ball of wax decision-making or the whole ball of wax of problem-solving, but it's actually useful to think of the problem-solving part and then the decision-making. Of course, when it comes to government, the decision-making is political. The problem-solving is professional. You hire staff, experts, consultants to do that. Decision-making in the political arena is done by people who are not experts, and they don't have to be experts. Oh, and it's not only in government, actually in the corporate world, the same thing. The ultimate decision makers in the board of directors is a board of directors who are lay people. They hire staff who are experts. On policy issues, the staff recommends policy. The board adopts it. In the political world, it's political decision makers whom we elect or appoint. And it's the staff who does the research, the analysis. And they may recommend which one is the best solution or which one is a better solution or more acceptable than others. So this is much more subjective than the problem-solving part. These are sort of minimum ingredients of the technical analysis. Now, there are hundreds of different problem-solving processes, hundreds. You can go to your library, there's a whole literature on problem-solving. What I've put together here are absolute rock-bottom minimum ingredients. What I mean by minimum, if your problem-solving process does not at least hit these steps reasonably well, you're doing sloppy work. And maybe you should be torpedoed. Not only will you be, but you should be. One of the minimum ingredients is you've got to define the problem that you're going to address. Now, any book you read on problem solving, there are 2-step processes, there are 20-step processes, there are 220 steps. Every book will tell you, don't you dare skip this step. It is, in fact, the most often skipped step. For some crazy reason, we quite often tackle a problem-solving situation and we jump right to a solution, which is the step way down here. while that sounds crazy, it's not as crazy as it sounds. And the reason is the human brain is very creative. It loves to solve problems. It is an inventive, creative. It thinks of solution, and the brain is sometimes capable of thinking of a solution in search of a problem, okay? So that just shows you're creative. But you've got to discipline yourself and say, if this is such a good idea, why is it such a good idea? What problem does it solve? What problem does it reduce? What opportunity does it maximize? Okay? And then you have to rigorously go through these and not just do this to justify what you wanted to propose in the first step. That analysis may take you in a very different direction. When I taught planning and public problem solving to my planning students at the University of Wyoming, it was an unusual program. It was a very small program, but it was aimed to train planning directors who, reasonably straight out of school, would be planning directors. The reason we had to do that is it's a very rural state. There are less than 500,000 people in this very large state. Because of their energy boom and bust cycle, they have lots of problems, human problems, all kinds of problems, because all of a sudden there's a boom, and people live in the sagebrush, and there's money, and there's violence, and there's drugs, and there are alcohol, and then there's a bust in the economy, and there are no jobs. And that's worse than the boom. So they go from one kind of problem to the other. And they will hire planners straight out of school into one-person offices, just 1- and 2-person offices. And they're responsible for a whole big area and lots of problems. The trouble with that is, in any organization, you eventually get to the executive director like Tom. He's an executive director of an agency, and an executive director means you don't report to another professional. You report to political decision makers. That's the executive interface, the policymakers to the top staff. That's a very delicate interface, and it takes a lot of experience to play this role well. If this executive director makes some serious mistakes, it can destroy the whole agency, okay, what may take years to create. In rural areas, they will hire a very inexperienced person for this. And it's not fair to them. They will make a mistake and it'll have devastating consequences. So we tried to train them so they could handle this delicate interface. Because on the one hand, it means you have to have the guts to stand up to political decision makers and tell them things maybe that they don't want to hear. On the other hand, you better not manipulate them. You better respect their responsibility to making policy decisions. You better not manipulate them. But you better not be a yes person and just tell them what they want to hear. Because there's a word for that. It's called irresponsible. So to be both responsive and responsible is tricky. Well, it's not tricky, but it's hard. There's tremendous pressure maybe to be irresponsible and sort of wimp out of irresponsibility and just do what's popular. Or to do far in the other direction, be unresponsive. Say, well, I know best, I'm a professional, they don't know. It's called unresponsive, and we, the public, we will have that agency earlier or later. One of the things I did for my students relative to this point here, I collected all sorts of planning documents and EISs, and I only collected good ones. And I must say, 60% of what I collected would get an F in my kind of training, where they have massive analysis on some major project, and they never even identified the problem. Now, if you read the whole thing, you can eventually figure out what the problem is. But there's a question, do these analysts really understand the problem? If they can write an entire report and never really tell us. So please take that to heart. This is step one. Now the steps over here are sort of judgment steps. One of the things you have to do is you have to make a judgment call. Is that really a serious problem? Because sometimes a problem will arrive in your in-basket that really shouldn't be there. It isn't a problem. And so in that case, you would have to talk back to people above you and say, I don't think we should be doing this. Another judgment call you have to make when you work on public sector project, ask, are we the right outfit? Are we the right entity? Maybe the enabling laws you have really suggest you shouldn't be doing this. Maybe there's a more appropriate one. In that case, you better talk back. You also need to question your own procedures and processes. Are the processes we're going to use appropriate and adequate? These things over here are more standard. You have to set goals and objectives. You have to analyze all the cause and effect relationships. This is called modeling. You have to model the system. How do you think things work? What affects what, which in turn affects what? This is the most scientific part of problem solving. Some more judgment steps. You have to question earlier decisions that probably got made in your project. You have to question constraints. You have assumptions. You have to question constraints. You have to generate the full range of alternative solutions. The single biggest mistake with this box is the most common mistake, the most tempting mistake is falling in love with the first reasonably workable solution. Say, I've got it, this is the best solution. All other ideas have to be dumb ideas. Oh, so that's just human. The human brain loves to do this. I remember when I did research on this back in the 60s, I found a guy who did a PhD thesis on just this one step. And he pointed out that one Nobel Prize winner concluded that the human brain loves to fall in love with the first reasonably workable solution. And it convinces itself that all other ideas must be dumb ideas. So if you're worth your salt as problem solvers, you will work very hard not to make that mistake, to explore the full range of solutions, because if this problem has solutions, chances are it has more than one. And we don't just mean variations on the same theme. There might be fundamentally different approaches. You have to predict the impact of each one of those solutions, both good and bad, desirable and undesirable, discrete and aggregate, direct and indirect, and you have to evaluate. I pushed this a little out of sequence because we bureaucrats, I've always worked as a bureaucrat. I was a planning director. I worked in a large consulting firm for some years before I went to university. We don't get to do this. We bureaucrats, we do this. Then we go to the decision makers and we recommend a solution and we try to get them to make a decision. So at the local government, it is the staff who recommends to a board or a commission or the city council. As we, the staff, go to them and try to get them to make a decision, we need to ask, have we developed consent with the public? Now, what we want you to imagine is a parallel process over here, a consent-building process, a public involvement process that starts the same day that that starts. And its whole purpose is to keep the public informed. What we think the problem is, that we think it needs to be addressed, so they realize we think it's our responsibility. We let them know how we're addressing it, what the process is, and about all of these. By the time we get down here, you should be done with the public involvement. Now, what some agencies do, they do all of this and then they do public involvement. Well, you can do that, but it's harder. And in fact, it's sort of natural to fall into that trap. It's tempting, because if you do public involvement while you're doing this, the public will ask questions you don't have answers for. And so it's tempting to say, well, we're not ready yet, which is partly true. So if you have the nerve to operate the way we suggest, you have to learn to say we don't know. When you tackle a problem, you don't know what the solutions are, you just think you have a problem. And so don't pretend you know things you don't know. But if you have done public involvement as you go along, what the purpose of this whole public involvement stream is to get the public to understand why you're proposing what you're doing. And even those folks who are opposed, at least they can say, well, I could live with that. We would call that consent. Now, I'm going to get around to consent and defining it in much more detail. And that's the question, do we have consent? So we bureaucrats, we owe it to the elected officials to develop consent by the time we get down here. Because if we don't, we put the political decision makers who have to do this, we put them in impossible situations. Because they really can't make a decision. If they feel that there are some folks out there who can't live with this. And so if we go to them, they will not make a decision. And the point is, political decision makers generally have a sixth sense whether you have or haven't developed consent. They can smell it. It's smelling the difference between survivable opposition and insurvivable opposition. They're not stupid. They know that no matter what you do, somebody's likely to be opposed. But what's the nature of the opposition? Do they feel, well, they don't particularly like it, but they can live with it, versus, boy, this is really bad. We shouldn't be doing this. That's fundamentally different. We'll elaborate more on that. The problem is, the process I just showed you is likely to morph into this process. Now, all I changed here is this here. That right here, we bureaucrats, we specialists, we do all this analysis, we get down to near the decision making, and all hell breaks loose. Okay? That's the problem. I did a PhD over 30 years ago on what do we bureaucrats do to be both responsible and responsive. Because that's what the public wants us bureaucrats to be. They want us to listen, but they also want us to accomplish the missions. It's not one or the other. The challenge is to be both, to do both. And what I stumbled across is a strange phenomenon. Something funny happened on the way to that PhD. We had a couple of findings, and let me simply explain them. One of the findings, I got involved in some case studies on transportation, and we found that most public officials are very frustrated by the fact that too many of their projects get stalled, stopped, shelved, compromised, you name it. At the same time, we found a few who had a totally different track record. They never got stopped. The projects were always implemented. And it sort of blew me away. Now, it was just an out-of-the-corner observation. I had to finish my thesis. I turned it in. I became a public official. But years later, about 10 years later, my wife and I started to invest more and more time into investigating this. Why do these people, whom we call implementation geniuses, why don't they get stopped? Why are they respected? Why are they trusted? They worked in the same politics. They worked on the same kind of projects. What they propose is very similar. And what we have done, Anna-Marie and I, we have spent the last several decades on analyzing what are their methods, what are their tactics, and we have sort of systematized what they do. That's all we've done. We think we have them figured out. I'll tell you the heart of what they do. The way they do public involvement is fundamentally different. Their analysis, their problem solving is the same. Their expertise is the same, what they propose. It's how they do public involvement, which is really strange because I had never taken an interest in public involvement. I'm a more technical person. What's also strange is they were not particularly good in developing support. They work less at developing support than other people. They focus their citizen participation efforts primarily at the bottom of the agreement-disagreement scale. So if I had a scale where when they propose something and somebody is way up here, they totally agree. If this was zero agreement, this is total agreement, and this is zero disagreement, total disagreement, they focus their efforts primarily down here. And if over down here we had somebody who is over my dead body opposed, what they do is they work with them to nudge them up, as high as they can get, but at least up. This is very different public involvement from what most people do. Most agencies aim their public involvement at the middle, where sort of the neutral people are, and they try to develop more and more support. That's not what these implementation geniuses seem to be doing. They work primarily on their fiercest opponents, and usually they can never get their support, because what you're proposing really might be a disaster for those people. It might, for example, bankrupt them. And if it does, don't expect them to support you. But they might be willing to consent, what we call consent, where they say, I hate this project, but I can live with it. I understand you have to propose this. It would be irresponsible if you didn't. You're doing the best you can. And so they sort of nudge these folks up just a little bit. Here's the definition of informed consent. It's a very strange thing they engineer and develop. The whole public involvement is aimed at doing this. Getting folks to conclude, even though I'm tempted to torpedo this, I could go along with it. They even show up at the final hearing and say, look, I have to be on the record as being opposed, but I don't want to kill this project. They may even thank the public officials who have done a very good job. God, I hate this project. These people are respected. These people are trusted. These people have a different relationship. That's the stuff we will primarily teach. Now look, we just gave you a quick and dirty overview. One of the topics we will cover there, we don't have time here, is that this consent building is much more necessary in our country than in any other country. And the reason is we have a fundamentally different form of government from others. Now, it took me years to figure this out. But we'll spend probably about a half a day just on how different this government is. And when I say this government, I mean the kind of democracy we have. Please understand, all other governments, whether they're democracies or not democracies, for example, Anne-Marie and I grew up in Switzerland. I know you thought we are native Wyomingites because of my strong Wyoming accent, but we're not. We were born in Switzerland, grew up in Switzerland. That's a democratic country. It has been a democracy for 700 years. It is a totally different democracy from the US. It's about the opposite of the US. But it's not just Switzerland, it's all countries. Let me ask a question before we get to asking questions. What is the key difference between the US government that I'm alluding to and all other forms of government? The individual. Yes. This is based on the individual. The single most important things are individual rights. It is more important than anything else. Now, that was actually invented by John Locke. Thomas Jefferson took John Locke's idea 100 years later, snuck it into the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence is really the specifications for the Constitution that came 10 years later. And please understand, it is a fundamentally different kind of government. The group is not important, the individual is. Now look, this is a strange kind of idea. No one had ever proposed this. Well, the British had, because in 1689 they adopted John Locke's idea and turned their monarchy upside down, but then Thomas Jefferson really took it to the extreme, where he proposed...
Never had a Bill of Rights.
No, none of them do. Europe is just now, they just wrote a constitution. The 25 presidents or prime ministers signed it a few months ago. They now have 1 year to adopt it. Go read it. You can find it on the internet. It is the opposite of the United States. The group matters, not the individual. I'll tell you why this is important. As wonderful as Thomas Jefferson's idea is, and it just was an idea, he didn't know, even he thought it wouldn't work. He thought it might work for 20 or 30 years and then he would have to revolt, okay? It actually has worked much better than he thought he would. Then who in the hell makes decisions if the individual is the primary thing? For example, in Switzerland, the moment you're in the minority, you have no rights. Individuals never matter, never will matter. In the United States, that's the only thing that matters. What it creates the opportunities for vetoes, for torpedoes. When in the United States, one person, one pissed off citizen kills a project, our system is working, it's not broken. That's why we have to do consent building. I see a lot of public officials, oh, well, our system is broken, these forefathers had no idea. No, they had very good ideas. Read what they wrote. They understood what they were doing. Thomas Jefferson was an anti-government extremist. He was convinced government is naturally evil. He got it from John Locke. He was infected by him. He was convinced that government naturally suppresses rights. It will steal its citizens blind in the name of the public good. And he said, if we're going to create a government, let's try to create one that is less likely to do that. And so he came up with a strange idea that the whole purpose would be so individuals would have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Now, John Locke had proposed life, liberty, and property, and the only change he made is, well, it's more than property, it's ideas, so it's pursuit of happiness. As beautiful as that idea is, and as unworkable as it seems to be for some people, one of the fallouts is it gives tiny groups, even one person, the opportunity to throw monkey wrenches into the works of government. We're here to tell you, if you become good at consent building, that individual, that small group, they will say, we can live with it. That's why consent building is more important in this country than in any other country. You know, those of you who work in government, if you had your job in Spain or France or Germany or Switzerland or Japan, you don't have to do consent building. You have 100 times the power you have here. Here, even one group can stop you. But if you develop their consent, they will not do so. They're not stupid. People realize they have no business dictating to the majority, but the majority cannot simply run over the minorities. It cannot. It's simply unresolved, but consent building resolves it. We have trained a lot of people, and even a lot of people who learn our stuff don't necessarily use it. The ones who use it, they are respected, they are trusted. We have phenomenal stories from them. They almost sound too good to be true. The water director in Des Moines, Iowa, had to turn off the water to 250,000 people. For 2 weeks, they could not flush a toilet. For a month, they could not drink the water. Businesses went bankrupt. High-rise buildings evacuated. In the whole history of the United States, there had never been such a water problem. He got fan mail. He became popular. They wrote poems about him. His counterparts up and down the drainage got class action lawsuits. They became public enemies. And let me tell you, they worked just as hard as he did. But he did consent building. He got people to understand, here's what I'm doing, here's the problem. And they saw he was trying. That he had really bought into his mission. And even though he was failing in the mission, he had respect, trust, admiration. The others worked just as hard. They experienced the opposite public. Anne-Marie and I have just been blown away how on the one hand we have this fabulous government. I mean, built on the idea that the individual matters. That even though that creates very difficult government, it's very difficult to get things done, that it is possible to develop consent. Then in the very same public, if you do consent building, people understand and they will let you do your stuff. That's what that training is going to be about, and that's what Tom asked me to talk a little about and make sure that people have some idea of what we will try to train them in. Now, let's have a number of questions. There's a question behind you there.
I agree that the problem solving is, and defining the problem is the important first step, and it's most often we jump to solutions. And I see that with Trillium, I see it with even the current proposal, jumping to solutions, and we're not sure what problem we're solving. And the same with Social Security, because sometimes it also has to do with how decision makers define the problem, because is the problem at Social Security privatization? Or
No, that would be a solution. That's
yeah,
not the
that's
problem.
a solution.
Yeah.
Or is the problem that they're not getting enough return at the top?
Sure.
So it depends on how you define the problem
Oh,
to get to
absolutely.
the solution. And oftentimes, I think we fail to do those alternative solutions. There must
Absolutely.
be a dozen alternatives to one of the current proposals on the out there for the Bayfront.
Well, and look,
Must be
there's
hundreds.
another step in there, this analysis. What if we don't quite understand how things work? If we misunderstand how things work, We come up, you know, that's a little bit like a doctor who they might diagnose your illness, but he doesn't understand how the illness works. Well, he's going to prescribe medication that won't work. So we got to get it right. We got to get all of this right. Yes, but that's doable. But it's not easy, and it's that over and over. There's a hand behind you there.
It seems to me that the most important and prior problem is to get consensus on what the problem is. Once you have the problem well developed in terms of consensus, then getting consensus on the solutions will be half as difficult.
Yes. I want to use this opportunity to explain why I hesitate using the word consensus and use this slightly less common word consent. The way most people define consensus, and of course there are 100 different definitions, but usually it means total agreement. Total agreement is neither possible nor necessary. I mean, if you had to function by consensus in your family, I suggest you could not operate your family. Because we're a very cantankerous bunch. We always have different. So it doesn't have to be consensus, but you're absolutely right. If we have an agreement, hey, we got a problem, and the nature of the problem, that is a giant step towards getting agreement on what the solution is. Okay? It does not mean you're home. Okay? There are many, many more steps, but you're absolutely right. It is the biggie. A couple hands behind you there.
Could there be too much consensus? This happens to the church I go to. They'll bring up some problem and they'll propose a solution. They go to the meetings, they'll say, do this pass, and everybody will say, yeah, aye. Like one instance, though, one person said no, and what? They weren't expecting it.
Are you saying, could there be too much agreement?
Yes.
Well, are you referring to what's called sort of groupthink, where the whole group is sort of got a dumb idea, and they all agree?
Well,
yeah, that can happen, of course. Sometimes the whole society is guilty of that. There are political examples of this. For example, JFK surrounded himself with people who thought differently, who had the nerve to speak up. See, one of the things, if you're in a leadership position, you got to be careful that you don't create groupthink. And so if a leader understands this, they will surround themselves with people who think differently and then encourages them to speak up. The problem is he had charisma. And the people who surrounded himself, they thought he was so smart that even when he had a dumb idea, they said, oh, well, that's why he's the leader, you know, oh boy, I'm glad I didn't bring it up, you know, when in fact, maybe they should have spoken up because it was really a dumb idea, which is why he made his brother Robert Kennedy Attorney General, because Robert Kennedy was not impressed by him and he did not mind arguing with him. And it was his effort to prevent groupthink. So groupthink can happen. It's a reality, and you'll get the booby prize if you do it.
Challenge or disaster.
Say again?
The
challenge or disaster. Yes, many of these kind of things, the challenge or disaster, where a whole bunch of people, there were some second thoughts, but they didn't percolate up enough. No, we know what we're doing. And then with hindsight, oh, how could we all have thought so? So yes, there is a danger of that.
During your lecture, Doctor, you mentioned a phrase, I don't know. I think a lot of people have a hard time with that. I know I did I have that problem as well. But it's just how do we get to the next stage where we say, look, I don't know, but I'll find an answer for you? Or is that part of what you're talking about here?
Sometimes when you say I find an answer, you're over-promising. Okay, I mean, you can say I try. But we train a lot of scientists, and I've had more than one high-level scientist in EPA or so who says, wow, they're asking us this. What should I tell them when I don't know? I said, oh, this one we've got figured out. Okay. Just say, I don't know. They said, well, that's one thing I can't say. I said, well, in that case, in the morning, get in front of the mirror and practice. I don't know. And after a while you will learn. Now, granted, you can get clever and have substitute answers. Every substitute answer, no matter how clever, will undermine your credibility. That's the problem. So never pretend that you know more than you know, but there's another form of dishonesty, and that is pretending to know less than you know. If you know somebody is playing some dirty game, and you don't have the nerve to bring it up, that is just as dishonest. So don't pretend that you know less than you know. Don't pretend that you know more than you know. Hand over here and the hand over there.
Once the process gets about halfway down, what's the likelihood that they can ever back up?
Good point. Always. These arrows are the way we analysts like to go through it. We try to go through it. But what really happens in real life is this. We get about a third through and say, oops, we made a mistake. We got to go back and redefine the problem. Then we get a little further and say, oops, we made another mistake. So actually, there are arrows from all boxes to all boxes. But if I show those, the diagram means nothing anymore. And we have to have the nerve to go back. We have to. If we think we made a mistake, it doesn't mean we study it forever. Just go and correct the mistake you made. Okay? Because you got to use the best information you have. And while this appears organized, in fact, the way problem solving happens as a result is pretty messy. We then, when we're all done, we sort of use this to explain it. But the way it happens is, yes, we jump forward and back, and that's just the way the brain is.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Okay, there was one over here, and let's take the neighbor over there.
I'm thinking about sort of how many issues get involved in our lives and how hard it is to make the case in all of them. I'm thinking pork is like this. I'm thinking research is like this. Every once in a while you get these public outrage that we're studying the sex life of some fly, or somebody's new park in their city in North Carolina, and we get outraged at all these things. And I tend to think myself that there are probably better reasons for these things than most people think.
Yeah.
That's not really the normal reaction. And I wonder how we can deal with that, or whether we can.
Look, it doesn't have to be a life-threatening crisis to be legitimate. There are a lot of humble problems that deserve to be addressed. And so what we will urge these people, don't use scare tactics, don't make a problem bigger than it is. People are willing to address problems that are humble kind of problems. But if you try to dress it up and pretend it's something else, while people may not know what you're doing, they can smell that there's something wrong with it. So Americans who are sort of anti-government, they're willing to pay through the nose if you're brutally honest and tell them why you're doing what you're doing, which has something to do with solving a problem, preventing a problem, It's when you don't have that minimum, where you want to do it because you want to do it. That's when the going gets tough. And that's when we start to distrust you, that you really have an agenda of your own, something other than what you're admitting. So in a way, agencies who save lives, they have an easier job selling us their legitimacy. But I can make the case for agencies with very humble missions, if they play a legitimate role in preventing problems, solving problems. Just don't exaggerate it. Don't make it worse than it is.